Hello and welcome to Retroformat Live Q&A. I'm Sean P. Malone, cinematographer and proud board member at Retroformat Silent Films. Tonight I'm happy to be speaking to a leading expert on women and early film culture, and as it happens, the curator of the Kino Lorber box set, Pioneer's First Women Filmmakers. And I have the set right here. If you are interested in silent movies or the origination of female filmmaking, please pick up this set, it's fantastic. My guest is Dr. Shelley Stamp. Professor Stamp, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Professor Stamp has served as a consultant for the National Film Preservation Foundation, Film Institute Netherlands, Turner Classic Movies, and the American Movie Classics cable channel. She's also a founding editor of Feminist Media Histories, an international journal, and is currently working on a comprehensive history of women and the silent screen in America, co-authored with Anne Morey. And actually, are you still working on that book, Professor Stamp?
Yes, we're still working on that book. The idea of a comprehensive history of women in silent screen in America, it's a very ambitious project. So it's taking two of us and it's taking us a long time, but it's a very exciting work.
I'm sure, and I can't wait to read it. Could you quickly tell our viewers, I just said you were the curator of this box set, which is obviously where our program tonight came from. But could you tell our viewers what that involved with the box set and your involvement in it?
Yes, this was an incredibly exciting project. The idea was to put together a box set of work by early female filmmakers in the US. And we worked in partnership with the Library of Congress and the Women's Film Preservation Fund to put together as comprehensive a set as possible. We started out with the idea of making 5 discs. And then we expanded to 6 discs with extras on the Blu-ray because there is so much material. That was the exciting part of it. And we wanted a really comprehensive view of all the different kinds of work that women were doing in the silent era as filmmakers. So we have represented on the set some of the best known female filmmakers of the silent era, like Alice Guy Blaché and Lois Weber. But we also have work that represents the range of kind of filmmaking that women were doing. So we have the first feature written and directed by an Asian American, and that's The Curse of Wan Wan, written and directed by Marion Wong in Oakland in 1915. We have amateur films made by Angela Murray Gibson in North Dakota. We have ethnographic films made by Zora Neale Hurston, some of the earliest and best ethnographic films of African American communities. So it's a set that includes 20 filmmakers, over 40 films, to really represent the scope of what women were doing. And so my job, happily, was to say, I want this, and I want this, and we need this, and we need that, and to try to get as much as we can, stuff that had been preserved, but also to preserve material that hadn't been released on disc before, that wasn't available before. The prints have all new scores, mainly by female filmmakers. I'm very, very proud.
Female composers?
Yes, sorry, female composers.
No,
yes.
I knew what you meant. I want to get into the films in a second, but you just mentioned, the scope of work, putting this set together, and it just, I was just struck by the scope of female filmmakers that were working in this period. And at Universal, and correct me if I'm wrong, at Universal, there were, during this silent period, there was like 170 films directed by women. Am I remembering that correctly?
You are remembering that correctly. And the reason that sounds incredible to you is that this history of female filmmakers, the depth and breadth of work by female filmmakers in the 1910s and early 1920s is a really unknown history. And companies like Universal, I don't think, celebrate that history enough. They have an extraordinary history. So this moment in the 1910s and early 20s was a moment of incredible opportunity for female filmmakers. There were many, many, many women making films in Hollywood and outside of Hollywood, as we'll see with Nell Shipman, right? And we forget that history. We tend to think that maybe were the first generation of female filmmakers, or maybe the 1970s represented the first moment when women really became filmmakers in Hollywood. And it's important for us to remember that 100 years ago, over 100 years ago, there were many, many, many prominent female filmmakers in Hollywood.
Yeah.
And all of the top screenwriters were women during this early period. So the creative influence that women had at the inception of the Hollywood industry was profound. And we're still catching up to that now. So it's really important to remember that the contemporary generation of female filmmakers have foremothers, 100 years ago.
Sure. I was just thinking of that word, foremothers. Well, let's talk about these specific films. Tonight we showed The Escape on the Fast Freight, which is part of the Hazards of Helen series. You had mentioned that at the time these were wildly popular and that people had something called serialitis. So can you tell us about serialitis, what that was?
Yeah, absolutely. The serials like The Hazards of Helen were incredibly popular in the mid-1910s. So people sometimes know about The Perils of Pauline. There were all these kind of alliterative serials, The Perils of Pauline, The Exploits of Elaine, The Hazards of Helen. They all feature female protagonists, often living outside of conventional family structures. So they're always unmarried. Sometimes they're often also orphans. And they are engaged in a series of incredibly daring, brave, physically adventurous adventures, and they perform amazing stunts. And these serials were released usually weekly. And in the case of Hazards of Helen, you have a series that runs for over 2 years that releases 119 different episodes, just little short 10 or 20-minute episodes that feature the same protagonist. And they are incredibly popular, especially with young women who come every week to see the newest exploit of Pauline or Elaine or Helen, right? And on the one hand, this kind of fandom was really welcomed by the industry, right? The industry is trying to grow its audience, is trying to grow female audiences in particular. And so it's kind of course you want everybody to come back every week. But there was another side to this. There were some gatekeepers of culture who started to pathologize, right? This addiction as serialitis, right? This malady of this compulsion to go every week to the movies. But it was it was a very, very, these films had a very dedicated, serious fan base. And you can see why, I think, even from the one episode that you showed tonight.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I had to, upon previewing the films for this conversation, I had to watch the other ones too, like what I wanted to see more adventures. They were really exciting. And, obviously we'll get to Back to God's Country in a second, but that's something these films have in common too, which is they're exciting and they feature women doing very exciting action-oriented things, taking agency, taking control of their situations. I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, there was a lady named Catherine Bigelow that made a big splash and everyone was saying, oh, a woman directed an action movie. Well, here we have action movies 100 years ago, that were in many senses authored by women, directed by women.
Absolutely. I think that's true of both of these films. The women have been writing and directing and acting, leading action adventure films for 100 years, right? And Helen Holmes, who stars in The Hazards of Helen, said at the time that if I want really thrilly action, I have to write it myself because the men will not write stunts that they won't perform themselves, right? And so Helen Holmes and all of the action adventure serial stars of this period, Pearl White again in particular, Kathleen Williams, were incredible role models for young women at the time, on and off screen. So on screen, you see them in these kind of daring adventures. And the episode of Houses of Helen that you showed is really typical of that series in the sense that, Helen is alone in a world of men. She is initially threatened or victimized. She's underestimated. She's underestimated in this case, she's fired, right? But then she saves the day through incredible adventures, incredible physical stunts, right? Lowering herself from a bridge onto a moving train, fighting men
That
on
was
a
cool.
moving train, jumping in from the moving train into the water. It's extraordinary. And we believe she did most of these stunts herself, Helen Holmes. And so that's, on screen, she's doing all that. But off screen, she's writing and directing some episodes. She took over for her husband, J.P. McGowan, when he was ill.
And was that the case with Escape on the Fast Freight?
Yes. And she and the other serial stars really, in their off-screen lives, the fan magazines really also portrayed them as adventurers, right? They drove cars at a time when women didn't always drive. They rode horses. Sometimes they flew airplanes. They were working mothers in many cases, right? So the fan magazines show them with their children or their children on set. Holmes even did a stunt at the California State Fair in 1917, sort of a live stunt to sort of prove her prowess. So they're really amazing role models for women at the time in terms of proving the kind of physical abilities that women have, proving the kind of creative work that women can do in Hollywood. But as we said a minute ago, they're role models for us now, 100+ years later, when we're still debating whether a female lead can carry an action picture or whether women can direct action films. And I'm sorry, that argument was proved 100 years ago. We don't have to keep debating it as far as I'm concerned.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I was watching her in some of those scenarios, I couldn't help but think of Buster Keaton and, the Indiana Jones films, came to mind. I mean, that was some very exciting stuff. And that's a good segue, I think, to Back to God's Country. We talked about Helen Holmes' involvement in the Hazards of Helen series, particularly this episode. What was Nell Shipman's involvement? Of course, the star of Back to God's Country. What was her total involvement in that film?
Yeah, she was the driving creative force behind Back to God's Country. And I think both The Hazards of Helen and Back to God's Country are really good examples of the way we need to expand our ideas about film authorship and creative control in these early years in particular, in a way that helps us recognize the collaborative effort that filmmaking is, but also that helps us see women's work. So in Shipman's case, she adapted the screenplay from a short story. She produced the film. She selected the director. She selected the cast. And she starred in it. She's the driving creative force. But because of a dispute during the production, she left the production company. And so she's really only credited on the film as an actress. But she was really the driving creative force behind the film. And that's true of all of her productions. And so I think it's important for us to think about filmmaking and film authorship in this kind of expansive way in this early period in particular, when roles were really fluid. And that enabled women like Helen Holmes to step into directing when her husband's ill, and it enabled Shipman to really control a production, even though she's not technically listed as the director, right?
You were talking about how these women are great role models behind the camera, but I'd imagine great role models in front of the camera for girls at that time and women at that time. You talked about obstacles they had to face. Often those obstacles were based on the fact, they're women, right? And this is how we treat women, or this is how we regard women. It's refreshing to see a film from this time tackle some of those issues.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in both films, I think what's striking is that the central female characters are alone in a world of men, right? They're the only women. And, we talked about how Helen is kind of underestimated, right, in the railroad world. Shipman faces a far greater danger, right? She faces a sexual predator. And so I think that one of the key points that's made in Back to God's Country is that the character Dolores is not threatened by wild animals. She's surrounded by wild animals. She's not threatened by really extreme natural surroundings, frozen tundra. She's threatened by a sexual predator. That's the threat, right? And so you're absolutely right. It's a kind of social commentary. But it's also a commentary about empowerment right? The Shipman's character in this film saves her male beau by driving a dog sled team across the frozen tundra for days, right? She's an incredible heroine of this film, in the same way that Helen's, finds the train robbers and brings them to justice. So absolutely, these are films about agency and empowerment in a world that underestimates women, where women are threatened, right, with sexual violence. So they're, and people often, say, well, why is it important to have female filmmakers, 100 years ago or now? And what you see in these films, I think, provide an answer, is that you see images of female agency and female strength, physical and mental strength, that we don't always get in other forms of culture.
Yeah, and that's enjoyable for both men and women to watch.
Absolutely, right. That's the other lesson of these films, right? Is that that action adventure films written and directed by women with female leads are still exciting for everybody.
Yeah, and in the essay, in the box set, you mentioned, you make a comparison to Griffith's female characters and how they contrast with the female filmmakers and characters that we see in this box set. And films like this really expand the look of, our understanding of female life at that time.
Absolutely, yeah, and the Griffith heroines are far more well known in the popular imagination, right? Most silent film fans can picture Lillian Gish, an extraordinary actress, but whose characters were sort of frail, white, childlike, infantile women in need of rescue, right? And
so much so that when she steps out of those roles, it's just so refreshing.
Yeah.
She is such a great actress.
Yeah, and those images of femininity that Griffith is creating, are circulating at exactly the same time as this great serial queens like Helen Holmes and Pearl White are embodying an entirely different kind of femininity, entirely different, not in need of rescue. In fact, they are rescuing the men.
Right.
Some people think of The Perils of Pauline as a serial where, Pauline is tied to the railroad tracks every week and her boyfriend comes to rescue her. It's the opposite scenario, folks. She rescues him week after week after week.
And there's even that moment in Escape on the Fast Freight when the burglars lock her in the cabinet, and the sheriff finally figures it out and he bursts in, but before he can get to the cabinet, she actually bursts out of the cabinet. And I thought, well, that's very intentional,
Absolutely. And in the Griffith last minute rescue scenario, the women are trapped in increasingly tiny interior spaces in their home, and they have to be rescued by often some sort of combination of the father, husband, police come in and rescue. And I think absolutely, you're not wrong to read this scenario as almost a commentary on that, as a refutation of that scenario.
I thought that was very intentional, because if you followed that trope to its logical conclusion, the sheriff would have arrived and let her out of the cabinet, but she bursts out before he can get to it. I have to mention some of the shots in Back to God's Country in that final sled sequence. I'm getting goosebumps as I talk about it, because one of my favorite movies of all time is Lawrence of Arabia. I just love Lawrence of Arabia. I adore it. And man, there's that one shot and you can see the sleds and they're like this big in the frame. And I'm like, David Lean saw this movie. I know he did. It was incredible.
The shooting conditions for Back to God's Country, unbelievable. They shot in remote northern Alberta, Canada, in the winter when it would get to be 60 below at night. And as you say, the landscape is a character in that film. The shots are gorgeous.
Yeah.
And
the cinematography too is, and knowing the medium they were working in, the black and white medium they were working in, and that film stock had pretty limited dynamic range. So it's basically like black on white, you know, you see these big white voids, you know, and then these little specks of black. They used the medium that they had at their fingertips just so expertly in that sequence, I thought.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing to mention about that film too are the animals. We have to talk about the animals.
Yeah.
Because that's really a feature of Nell Shipman's films. She always has these extraordinary animal characters. And I'm trying to figure out, there's a raccoon, an owl, there's the bear cub, there's the adult bear, and the dog, of course, and they're characters in the film, the dog in particular, right? It's instrumental in the rescue. And Shipman was very articulate about what she wanted to do. You know, she said she felt she needed the animals in that film to get away from the sort of humdrum triangle, as she said, of, you know, bad man threatens woman, woman is rescued. She wanted something else. And so the work that she did with those animals is really amazing. And she also talked about how she, you know, as an actress earlier in her career, she'd seen a lot of animal cruelty on film sets. And she really wanted to work with animals in a different way. And so the way that she uses the whole natural environment, you know, the Arctic tundra, the snowy tundra of northern Alberta, the sort of mountainous terrain of northern Alberta, the animals that are native to that landscape. It's really extraordinary.
Well, before we wrap up, women were pretty prolific, seemingly, during this period of time, and then not so much in the 20s and 30s. So what happened?
Excellent question. That's the question everybody asks. Well, the two questions are, how did I not know about this? And then what happened? You know, why did this not continue? And the answer is relatively simple. So there's a moment of opportunity that happens in the early 1910s when movies are becoming incredibly popular, when there's a tremendous need for product, right? Nickelodeons are changing their program every 2 or 3 days. There's a need for all kinds of short films. The film industry isn't yet consolidated in Hollywood in the early 1910s. And so there's opportunities for women all over the country who have a little bit of creative gumption and maybe a little bit of money to get in on the ground floor. So women who are actresses then start writing and directing. Women who are writing journalism start writing screenplays. There's all sorts of avenues in those early moments. And that creates this incredible window so that by the mid to late 1910s, there's all kinds of women. And as we said a minute ago, all kinds of women at studios like Universal, right, making films. That window shuts down in the early 1920s, and it shuts down pretty quickly. And what's happening in the early 1920s is that studios are consolidating control of the industry. They're buying up theater chains and driving out independent theater owners and driving out independent production companies. And so there's a lot of independent production companies that collapse in the early 20s, many run by women. So Shipman's company collapses, Lois Weber's company collapses, Alice Guy Blanchet's company collapses, right? And also many other production companies operated by African Americans. This is the same window of opportunity for Black filmmakers in the 1910s, and that shuts down mostly in the early 20s. And it's because of this kind of control that the studios exercise. And those studios are become reluctant to hire women. Trade unions start to get popular, and unfortunately the unions also want to keep out women and people of color. So somebody like Lois Weber, who has a long history of directing, right, beginning in the early 1910s, when she's directing in the late 1920s, what she says is it's an entirely different landscape. When she comes on set, male crews don't respect her, and she says she can't believe that. She's not totally unaccustomed to that, right, in 1927 versus 15 plus years ago, right?
Right.
So that's in a nutshell what happens. So that by the 30s, you have really only Dorothy Arzner directing in Hollywood.
Mm-hmm.
Her career ends in the early 40s. And then in the late 40s and into the 50s, Ida Lupino is the only woman directing in Hollywood. And it's really not until the 70s when you start to get a cohort of female filmmakers again. So it's a really unfortunate history.
Yeah.
You know, it's amazing to think what would have happened if that group of female filmmakers kept making films and new generations of female filmmakers were making films in those same numbers in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s. We'd have an entirely different history of American film. We really would.
I really appreciate your time tonight. And of course, we want to remind our viewers, this set is excellent. The Pioneers, First Women Filmmakers. It's Kino Lorber. You can pick it up online, Amazon, etc. Fantastic discussion. I know our viewers were appreciative of it as well. Thank you so much, Dr. Stamp, for sharing your thoughts with us tonight.
Oh, thank you. It's always a delight to talk about these films and these filmmakers. The more people that see this work, the better, as far as I'm concerned.
We also want to thank our partners in this screening, Kino Lorber. They put out the brilliant box set, which I've mentioned. If you enjoyed tonight's performance, please consider making a suggested donation of $7 to Retroformat Silent Films at retroformat.org/donate. Your support really does mean the world to us. We want to keep bringing programs just like this to you. Thanks again for joining us. Be sure and join us in 2 more weeks for our next Silent Movie Monday. Until then, I'm Sean P. Malone. Thanks for watching.